Now it's time for another Board Game Brawl preview with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey now, my name is Nick, this is Board Game Brawl, and today we're going to be taking a look at a game that is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter. That game is called Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift, and it's from Dragon Dawn Productions. Now, if you like what you see throughout the rest of this preview video, I'm going to encourage you to go to the official Kickstarter project page. I'm going to have a link down in the description section of this video, and you can also click on the card up in the top corner. That will take you to a link that will take you to the official Kickstarter project page. You can find out more information than I could possibly tell you in this short video, and hopefully you'll consider backing the project. Now, what is Perdition's Mouth? This is a cooperative game for 1 to 6 players, where each player takes control of a hero who is trying to go down and infiltrate the cult of this insect god in this dark and deep dungeon. You will face all manner of threats. You'll fight cultists and these disturbing creatures. You'll find victims of the cult all around that you can either rescue or not, and you are trying to cooperatively work your way down through this dungeon. There's a lot of really interesting mechanisms that really do not pop up in a lot of other dungeon crawl games, things that you might not expect. So let me go ahead and give you a brief overview with a prototype version of the game. I want to stress that. So what you see may not be in the final version of the game. Then we're going to come back. I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, I'm going to give you a brief look at Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift. Now, I have to stress here that this is a prototype version of the game, so what you see in the final version is going to be much different than what you see here, but this is just to give you a taste of what the game is like. I should also note that this is a game that is meant to be played over the course of a campaign, and you have many, many different options as to how you want to go through the campaign, and you can even do things as one-shots if you really want to, but there's different scenarios. The whole other side of this game board has a completely different map on it. You have all these different types of scenario cards that you may go through with different types of scenarios and also different difficulties as well, as for instance hard or standard mode. We are playing with this, or what I have set up here is the side entrance and on the standard difficulty. On one side of it, you're going to have a little bit of a story blur, which I won't spoil for you. And on the other side, it will remind you of some of the different rules of the particular scenario, as well as the setup and the spawning rules are on the bottom of the card. So as I mentioned, the scenario will tell you how to set up the board. The heroes' figures will always start off outside of the board, and they'll have to use a move action just to get into the entrance. You'll always denote where the exit of the place is going to be, where the different enemy units like these guards and acolyte are, and as well as any other objective tokens that might be on the board. The board itself will also have marks denoting certain features. For instance, these are rubble tokens or rubble squares that are going to be much more difficult for you to move on. There are other notable things that you have to do during setup and things that you have to place out. For instance, you have over here, you have the Rock of Destiny. This is what the players are going to use during the course of the game to determine which actions that they're eligible to take. This is a rondelle style mechanism in the game. Each of these different spaces here denotes something different. So you have movement and attack and defend and even rest, which you're going to use to refill your hand. But you can only take actions at certain points. Now these markers here will, sorry, I don't even know what is there. But these markers here are keyed into each of the different heroes in the game, and you will spend action points to move around this rondelle and therefore be able to move the different spots and take those actions, assuming there are spots available for you. You see these little peg marks here on the board? Those will tell you how many open spots there are for a particular action. So, for instance, in this case, only one person may rest at a time. In stark contrast to the Rock of Destiny, you have the Enemy Watch House, which is going to keep track of the enemy actions. You see those along the edges there, as well as the threat meter, which becomes more deadly as more heroes are added to the game. And here are some of the other prototype miniatures that you can see, just to show you that there are a lot of different things that you may encounter during the course of the game, during a campaign or a one-shot of the game. Lots of different creatures, treasure chests, and these happy fellows here, which are victims that are being tortured. Of course, trying to perhaps save those victims and complete objectives and defeat enemies are the heroes of the game. Every hero is going to have their own character sheet with their name and race. So this is Bastion the human. But there are many other characters you might take control of. So for instance, you have Niffle, who is also a human. Sorry, let me get that down there. You have Niffle, you have Sima, the halfling, you have Alazable, I never know how to pronounce his name, the dwarf, Alisa, the elf, and so on. And there are several different things to note on the character sheet. So up in the top corner is the symbol of that particular character, which will correspond to the pegs that you use for your hit points and for what you use on the Rock of Destiny. The class of the character, so this is the warrior class, and there's healer and magic user and so on. Their range, whether they are going to be melee or a ranged character, name and race, and then over in the corner you have how many cards you draw at the start of the game, and also with the rest action, and then the maximum hand size that you have. Underneath that, there's special rules if you're playing on hard mode, and then the special ability. Anytime you see this purple symbol, that is the special ability, special attack that this character can use. So, for instance, Bastion here, a Mighty Swing allows you to maim several foes at once. You may attack one foe, and if your attack hits, immediately make another attack against a foe in range. Then down at the bottom, you have all the different stats and the hit points of the character. So this is the hit point meter. It starts off at their max, and then it will move down slowly. And notice that these rows correspond with each other, because as you take damage, your effectiveness in each of your stats decreases. So this is action points, this is range, this is your attack strength, and your defense strength. As you go down in hit points, those stats are going to lower, except for range for this particular character, because he always fights in melee. Now, every hero is going to have a deck of cards that they will be drawing from that they're going to use to fuel all of their different actions. In the top corner of the card, it will tell you which action these cards can be used for. So, for instance, this is a defensive action, his Shield Wall. You can play this card when you take the defend action until the start of your next turn. All heroes adjacent to you are defending. Then there are other cards like this one, which can be used for any of the actions. This one is multi-purpose. You can add 2 to your total for whatever action you're trying to perform, as opposed to Killer Instinct here, which can only be used if you're making your special attack or one of your normal attacks. It gives you a 5 to add to that, or you can do 1 for aiding. You can actually play these cards to aid one of your allies when they're trying to perform the action. Again, must be depicted on the card. There are many different cards in the game. There's also, you might find items during the course of the game which are going to help you out, like armor, but you might also run into traps as well, which you definitely do not want to willingly do, but sometimes that may be the case. So there's different armor and weapons that you might come across. There is a response deck. The response deck is actually primarily going to be used by the enemies. It determines their randomness, so when they make attacks, when they move, things like that. But you'll also use it when you have to do defense, or when some weird special ability requires you to do so. There's also wound cards. If you get wounded, you may have to take these into your hand. And not only are they going to take up space in your hand, remember that you do have a hand limit in the game, they're also, whenever you play them, whenever you're forced to play them, eventually, you're going to have to take a penalty with all these different things. So you definitely do not want to get these if you can avoid them, but sometimes you have to. And if you're not able to heal them and get rid of them permanently, even when you are use them and discard them, they simply go into your discard pile, which means they may go into your deck eventually. And lastly, there are victim cards. There are victims that you're going to have to, hopefully you can do what you want, but you can try and rescue them during the course of the game if the scenario calls for them. So this can be a brutal game, and you will come across people being tortured, and you're going to have to figure out what to do with them. Oh, and of course, there is a way to keep track of the stats of the monsters themselves. Oh, by the way, this is a little cheat sheet, action sheet for all the different icons in the game. But this is going to keep track of all the different enemies that you might encounter. So you have acolytes, guardians, summoners, and the demon, who may pop up in very specific scenarios, like in a final scenario or when called for. So the easiest way to just run you through the rest of the game is to tell you how a round of play is going to work. First and foremost is the hero phase. This is where each hero is going to take a turn. Now, there is no set turn order. You and the other players can decide which order you want to play in, but when it is your turn, the first thing you do is gain your action points. So whatever your character sheet says you gain as far as action points, you now have those to spend, and you use those action points to move around on the Rock of Destiny. And wherever you end up, if there's an open space, you are going to take that action. So, in other words, Olmazal here, I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm butchering his name, might be taking taking the move action, in which case he's allowed to now play cards in order to boost that action if he wants to, if they have the movement symbol on him, and he will move the applicable number of spaces. Again, you may be forced to draw cards from the response deck if required, but not all the time, and you may have other types of actions that you wish to take as well. Sometimes you just have to sit it out until you wait for an applicable open spot to open up. Another example would be the sprint action. So, for instance, if there was enough heroes in the game and all of the move spots were taken, one of the heroes may choose to sprint on a later turn. When they sprint, they're going to play cards in order to move, but they also draw a card from the response deck. Then you move on to the enemy phase. And the first thing you do for the enemy phase is draw one of the response cards and see if it has this eye symbol up in the top corner. If it has that symbol, then you have to do some shuffling with the enemy reserves. Now, I didn't have enough of the prototype miniatures to really illustrate this, but you have different spawning pools during the game. You have a primary spawning pool, a secondary spawning pool, and the reserves. Whenever you would have to perform a primary spawn, of course, it would come from there. Then there's secondary. Secondary moves into the primary spawning pool, and then the reserves are where you feed both of those spawning pools. If one of those eye cards happens to be on the response card you draw at the start of the enemy phase, then you have to take 2 enemy figures from the reserves and put them into the primary spawn pool and the secondary spawn pool. If there's not enough for you to do that, you don't do it. Once you get done determining that, then you actually look at the number that was on the card, which in this case happened to be a -1. But whatever that number is, you are going to move clockwise on the enemy track here on the watchtower in order to determine what action is going to be taken. So it might be clockwise if it's just a positive number, but in this case, if it was a negative number, you'd actually move backwards. Whatever action you end up on, that's what each enemy is going to try to do. It might be movement, it might be attacking, or it might be one of the spawnings. But whatever it is, again, you're going to have to draw from the response deck in order to determine what happens. So if it was a move action, which in this case would be bad for the heroes, then the enemies get to move that number of spaces. You get the idea. When attacks break out, whether it is the enemies or whether it's the heroes attacking the enemies, there are line of sight rules that you have to follow depending on the type of attack that you're doing, whether it's ranged or melee. And then attacks are going to happen in the same way that you handle most of the other things in the game. If you are a hero and you're making an attack, you're going to play cards from your hand that actually have the combat symbol, and in that way you're going to be able to boost trying to rip through your opponent's defenses. And your opponent has a chance to add their defense rating, whatever that might be. So if it was an Acolyte, it would just be 1 here, to a card from the response deck. And in fact, so do the heroes in that particular case. If you're attacked, you look at whatever your defense rating is, which again is going to be higher before you start taking damage, and then add a response card's number to it. That is the randomness element of the game. No matter what, you and the other characters are trying to meet your objectives, get through levels, take out enemies, rescue victims, or not. It is entirely up to you. Follow the beats of the story and try to survive Perdition's Mouth, the Abyssal Rift. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. The theme is a very interesting aspect of Perdition's Mouth because while there are a lot of fantasy dungeon crawlers out there, this one has a very, very dark tenor and tone to it. Really just has that sort of biting edge that a lot of other fantasy games don't. And that's very significant because it sort of keeps the game from slipping into that generic territory. I've seen a lot of fantasy games, unfortunately, in the last couple of years that really just all story-wise and theme-wise feel like cookie cutters of each other. This one, while it has some familiar elements, manages to set itself apart as far as the theme, and that's always a very good thing as far as I'm concerned. When you get into the mechanisms of the game, there's other things that definitely set this one apart. Yes, you are moving along on the grid and all these different tiles from square to square, which does feel familiar. If you are familiar with dungeon crawlers, you'll feel right at home at first. But then it gets into the action system, and that's where things are really interesting. The game uses the rondelle system. It's the Rock of Destiny is what the official name of it is in Perdition's Mouth. And the rondelle is something that's really only been used in heavy Euro games up to this point. Games that are just about moving resources around and gaining resources and trading them and swapping them and getting them for victory points. Now it's being used in a dungeon crawl system, and the purpose of it is to simulate the sort of fickle nature of of life in general, and how you, especially when you're dungeon crawling, you're adventurers, and things just don't go as planned, and you can't always do exactly what you want, but you do have control over the actions that you take, depending on the action points that you spend. So maybe you don't get exactly what you want, but perhaps you can do something just almost as useful or even more useful. It forces you to think outside of the box and come up with different solutions to different scenarios, which gives it a much more dynamic feel than many other dungeon crawlers. And the enemies, unfortunately, have the same type of innovation, meaning that they're also going to have you can't always predict what their actions are going to be. And I say unfortunately only because that makes it more difficult for the heroes, but of course that is another interesting aspect of the game as well, that you have this the fluctuating tides of battle and how the enemies are going to react, never quite being able to predict what they do, but you do have strategy. You can theorize, okay, here's what's possible, how do we react to that, how do we strategically place ourselves in such a way that we're able to cope with incoming enemy attacks or how they might move and position themselves, which is a really interesting aspect of the game, and it sort of gives it that strategy mixed with tactics that a lot of other games lack. It seems to be either just one or the other in so many other games, dungeon crawling or not. This one mixes those two disparate elements. So it's really interesting, especially when you mix it together with the unique theme. And there's all kinds of other interesting aspects of the game, like how your damage can dictate what your stats are, and how the response deck and how that can be used for, especially even for heroes, with their defenses. It's just it's definitely got a unique feel to it, and you add together with the storytelling elements and how you can choose standard or hard mode, and that not only dictates how hard the scenarios are, but also can change the storyline and the scenario cards as well. Being able to play it as a one-shot game, being able to play it as a campaign game, or being able to play it from anywhere from 1 to 6 players gives the game a lot of versatility. So if you like dungeon crawling games, if you like the idea of dungeon crawling games but haven't really found one that's worked for you because they all kind of feel the same, you might want to give Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift a shot because it feels so much different than any other kind of game in this genre. And if you like miniatures, if you like the fantasy theme, if you like, visceral combat and working together cooperatively, again, you might want to check this game out. So I'm going to have a link in the description section of the video, and also if you click on the card up in the top corner, that'll take you to the official Kickstarter page for Perdition's Mouth. Find out more information and hopefully consider backing it. That is Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift from Dragon Dawn Productions. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com.